The Smurl haunting. I remember the first time I heard about the Smurl family. It was the summer of 1974, a humid day when the air was so thick it seemed to cling to your skin. The kind of day where everything felt just a little bit off, like the world was holding its breath. The Smurls had moved into their new home in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, hoping for a fresh start. It was a modest two-story house, painted a dull shade of white with green shutters that had seen better days. From the outside, it looked like any other suburban home, a place where a family could build a life, surrounded by neighbors who would lend a hand when needed. But there was something about that house, something that felt wrong. It started small, as these things often do, the odd smell of something rotten wafting through the rooms, the unexplained chill that would settle in the air even on the warmest of days. The Smurls, Jack, Janet, and their 4 children, dismissed it at first. New houses had quirks after all. They figured it was just the house settling or maybe a dead animal trapped somewhere in the walls. But then the noises began. The low, guttural growls that echoed through the halls at night, and the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, just outside their bedroom doors. Jack would get up heart-pounding, convinced that someone had broken in. But every time he checked, the house was empty. Janet started noticing things too. Items moving on their own, the TV flickering on and off even when it was unplugged. She tried to ignore it, to rationalize it away, but the unease gnawed at her, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Janet decided to take a bath to calm her nerves. She was soaking in the warm water, trying to let the tension slip away when she felt it. A cold hand on her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open, but no one was there. The bathroom was empty, save for the steam rising from the water. Her heart raced, and she scrambled out of the tub, wrapping a towel around herself. As she looked into the mirror, she saw it. Words scrawled across the glass in what looked like blood. "Get out!" She screamed, and Jack came running, but by the time he arrived, the words had vanished. He tried to calm her down, to reassure her that it was just her imagination. But Janet knew what she had seen, and she knew it wasn't her imagination. The terror escalated from there. The children began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming about the shadows that moved on their own, the whispers that called their names. Furniture started shifting on its own, chairs stacking themselves in precarious towers in the middle of the night. The Smurls were at their breaking point, desperate for answers. That's when they called Ed and Lorraine Warren. I had heard of the Warrens, of course. Anyone interested in the paranormal had. They were legends in their own right, having investigated some of the most notorious hauntings in the country. When they arrived at the Smurl house, they were calm, composed, professionals in the face of something that should have been impossible. Ed set up his equipment. Lorraine walked through the house, her eyes narrowing as she reached out with her unique gift. After what felt like an eternity, she turned to the Smurls, her face pale. "There is something here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something dark, and it's getting stronger." That night, as the Warrens began their investigation, the house seemed to come alive. The temperature plummeted, the walls shuddered as if something was trying to break free. The growls returned, louder, more menacing, and then the attacks began. Janet was the first. She was thrown across the room by an unseen force, her body slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. Jack tried to pull her to safety, but he was struck too, his face contorting in pain as something invisible clawed at his skin, leaving deep, bloody gashes. The Warrens fought back, reciting prayers, demanding that the entity reveal itself. But it only laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to echo from the very depths of hell. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The house fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly, but the damage had been done. The Smurls were terrified, huddled together, clinging to each other for comfort. But as the Warrens packed up their equipment, Lorraine caught my eye, her face drawn and exhausted. "This isn't over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just the beginning." As I drove away from the Smurl house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lorraine was right. There was something in that house, something evil, and it wasn't done with the Smurls yet. The nights that followed were unbearable. The Smurl house seemed to thrum with an unholy energy, like the very walls were vibrating with something ancient and malevolent. Sleep was a luxury none of us could afford anymore. Certainly not the Smurls, and not even those of us on the outside, who felt the dark pull of that place. Jack had started sleeping on the couch in the living room, though sleeping wasn't really the right word. He mostly just lay there, staring at the ceiling, his eyes bloodshot and wide, waiting for the next attack. Janet spent her nights in the children's room, trying to comfort them. But how do you comfort a child when you don't even believe the words coming out of your own mouth? It was Lorraine who suggested we perform a blessing ritual. She believed that if we could weaken the entity's hold on the house, we might buy the family some peace, at least enough to get through the night. The Smurls were desperate, willing to try anything, so we agreed to perform the ritual that very evening. We gathered in the living room, Lorraine holding her rosary beads, Ed with his Bible open to the pages of Psalms. Jack held onto Janet's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white, while the children huddled close, their eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with anticipation, and as the first words of the blessing were spoken, a deep growl emanated from the walls, rattling the windows and causing the lights to flicker. "We are not welcome here," Lorraine murmured under her breath. But she continued, her voice steady as she led the family in prayer. That's when the temperature dropped again, so fast it felt like stepping into a freezer. Our breaths became visible puffs of air, and the growls turned into something more, a cacophony of voices, screaming, crying, whispering foul curses. The room darkened, the only light coming from the flickering candles we had placed around the room. And then the entity struck. It started with the chandelier above us, swinging violently back and forth before crashing to the floor in a spray of shattered glass. The children screamed, and Janet pulled them closer, shielding them with her body. But the worst was yet to come. Suddenly, Jack was lifted off the ground, his body suspended in the air as if held by invisible hands. His limbs contorted unnaturally, his face twisted in pain as he was flung across the room, slamming into the wall with a force that cracked the plaster. Before anyone could react, he was pulled up again, this time by the neck, his body hanging limply as he gasped for breath. "Put him down!" Lorraine shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the deafening roar of the entity. She began to recite a prayer, her voice trembling with fear, while Ed tried to reach Jack, but an unseen force kept him back, pushing him away every time he got close. It was then that I saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving toward Jack. It had no form, no face, just an overwhelming presence that seemed to suck all the light out of the room. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach as I realized this was no ordinary haunting. This was something far worse, something evil in its purest form. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, Jack was released, dropping to the floor in a crumpled heap. He gasped for air, his face pale and slick with sweat. We rushed to him, but as we did, a loud guttural laugh filled the room, reverberating off the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, but the damage was done. Jack was barely conscious, his body battered and bruised, and the rest of the family was in shock, too terrified to move. "We have to get out of here," Janet whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here." But Lorraine shook her head. "Leaving won't help. Whatever this is, it's attached itself to you, to your family. It will follow you wherever you go." Those words hung in the air, heavy with despair. We all knew she was right. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't bound to the house. It was bound to the Smurls. As the night wore on, we tended to Jack's wounds as best we could. But there was no treating the fear that had taken root in all of us. Lorraine and Ed stayed with the family, refusing to leave them alone in that cursed house. I remember Lorraine's words as she and Ed huddled together, planning their next move. "It's playing with us," she said, her voice low. This was just a warning. It's getting stronger. The following days were a blur of fear and dread. We could feel it in the air, a malevolent force growing more powerful with each passing hour. The activity in the house escalated. Doors slamming on their own, objects flying across rooms, unseen hands leaving bruises on the children's skin. And then there were the nightmares. Each of the Smurls began to experience the same horrifying dream. Trapped in a room with no doors or windows, the walls closing in as a dark figure watched from the shadows. They would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, only to find that the figure was still there, standing at the foot of their bed, watching, waiting. It was clear that this entity wasn't just haunting the house. It was invading their minds, their souls. We had underestimated it. This was more than just a haunting. It was a battle for survival, and the Smurls were losing. After the attack on Jack, we knew we couldn't wait any longer. The entity wasn't just a spirit. It was something much darker, something that fed on fear and pain. Every day it grew stronger, bolder, and it was clear that if we didn't do something soon, the Smurls would be lost to it. Ed and Lorraine Warren decided it was time to perform a full exorcism. They had contacted the church seeking permission for a priest to conduct the ritual. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and time was something we didn't have. So, they took matters into their own hands. That night, the house was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds that seemed to cling to the sky like a shroud. As we prepared for the exorcism, the Smurls gathered in the living room, clinging to one another like a lifeline. The fear was palpable, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside set us all on edge, as if we were waiting for the house to make its move. Ed took the lead, clutching his Bible so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Lorraine stood beside him, her eyes closed, as if she were trying to sense the entity's presence, to feel where it was lurking. It was clear that she was deeply troubled, more so than we had seen before. "There's something here. Something different," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hammering of my heart. "It's not just one entity, it's many, and they're all drawn to something, or someone." As she spoke, the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, colder. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls, and the temperature plummeted so fast that our breath became visible. It felt like the house was closing in on us, like the walls were slowly tightening their grip. Ed began the ritual, his voice steady but strained as he recited the prayers, commanding the entity to reveal itself and leave the family in peace. The words echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls, but the house remained still, almost too still. And then it began. The smell hit us first, an overpowering stench of decay like something long dead rotting in the walls. It was so strong that it made us gag, our eyes watering from the sheer foulness of it. The growling started next, low at first, but growing louder, more menacing, until it filled the room, a cacophony of voices overlapping, each one more disturbing than the last. The growling was followed by laughter, deep, guttural laughter that seemed to come from every corner of the house. It was the sound of pure malice, of something that enjoyed our fear, that reveled in our terror. The lights suddenly went out, plunging us into complete darkness. The only light came from the flickering candles that surrounded us, casting long, ominous shadows that seemed to twist and contort into grotesque shapes. In that darkness we could see them, figures moving, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. They were tall, thin, and shadowy, their forms barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. And then the attack began. The shadows lunged forward, moving faster than any human could. Janet was the first to be struck, her body lifted off the ground and thrown across the room like a rag doll. The children screamed as unseen hands grabbed them, pulling them toward the darkness. Jack tried to fight back, but he was overpowered, pinned to the floor by a force so strong that it was impossible to resist. Lorraine's voice rose above the chaos, shouting prayers, demanding that the entity release its grip. But her words seemed to have no effect. The shadows continued their assault, their laughter growing louder, more frenzied. I could feel something cold and sharp wrap around my ankles, pulling me toward the darkness. My heart raced, panic surging through me as I struggled to break free. It was then that Lorraine screamed. We turned to see her standing in the center of the room, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at something we couldn't see. Her hand shot out, pointing at the far corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. "There, it's there!" she cried, her voice trembling with fear. "The source! It's coming from the basement!" The basement. We had avoided that place ever since the activity began. There was something about it, something that made it feel different from the rest of the house. It was a place that none of us wanted to go, but now it was clear that we had no choice. Ed grabbed a flashlight and with a nod from Lorraine, led the way. We descended the narrow, creaking stairs into the basement, each step feeling like it could be our last. The air grew colder the further down we went, the stench of decay growing stronger with each passing second. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight flickered, casting a dim, eerie glow over the room. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with the detritus of a life lived. Old furniture, boxes of forgotten memories, and something else. Something that drew our eyes like a magnet. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, was an old wooden door. It was out of place in the modern basement, its wood dark and rotted, the hinges rusted and ancient. Something about it sent a shiver down my spine, a deep primal fear that I couldn't shake. Ed moved cautiously toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. As his fingers brushed the wood, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light. Lorraine gasped, clutching her chest as if she could feel the malevolence emanating from that darkness. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where it's coming from. This is its lair." Ed stepped forward, shining the flashlight into the void, but the light didn't penetrate the darkness. It was as if the darkness was alive, absorbing the light, feeding off it. He reached out with the flashlight, trying to see what lay beyond, but the moment his hand crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The impact knocked us back, and before we could react, the entire basement began to shake. The walls groaned, the floor buckled beneath us, and the air was filled with the sound of hundreds of voices screaming in unison. It was a sound so terrible, so filled with agony and despair, that it felt like it could drive a person mad. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The basement fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly, but the door remained closed, its dark secrets locked away once more. We stumbled back up the stairs, our bodies and minds battered by the experience. It was clear that whatever was behind that door was the source of the evil in the house. But confronting it would require more than just prayers and rituals. As we reached the top of the stairs, Lorraine turned to Ed, her face pale and drawn. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not ready for this. Not yet." Ed nodded, his expression grim. "But we'll be back," he promised. "We'll be back, and we'll finish this." But as we left the Smurl house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only just scratched the surface of the horror that lay within. And whatever was behind that door, it was waiting for us to return. Days passed after the incident in the basement, but the terror didn't let up. The Smurl family was haunted by relentless nightmares, the kind that made sleep a dangerous gamble. No one in that house was safe. Even during the day, the atmosphere was thick with an unnatural heaviness, like the air itself was watching, waiting. There was no escaping the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Ed and Lorraine Warren had retreated to their home, poring over every book, every scripture, every ancient text they could find in search of a way to combat the evil in the Smurl house. They knew that whatever was in that basement was more than just a spirit. It was something older, something that had been waiting for the right moment to make its move. And they feared that moment was coming soon. The Smurls were growing desperate. Jack had started keeping a crucifix on him at all times, clinging to it like a lifeline. Janet, once the strong pillar of the family, was beginning to crack under the pressure. The children were withdrawn, their innocent laughter replaced by haunted silence. They were living in a nightmare, and there seemed to be no waking from it. Finally, after days of preparation, Ed and Lorraine returned to the Smurl house with a plan. They had gathered a small team of trusted colleagues, priests and psychics who had faced similar situations, though none quite as dire as this. The decision was made. They would enter the basement one final time, confront whatever was lurking there, and banish it once and for all. The night of the confrontation was cold and still, the kind of night that seemed to hold its breath. The team gathered in the Smurl living room, their faces drawn and tense, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. The air was thick with fear and anticipation, and the house seemed to groan under the strain, as if it knew what was coming. Ed spoke first, his voice steady but laced with a tension that belied his calm exterior. "We're going to confront whatever's in that basement. This entity has been feeding off your fear, growing stronger with each attack. Tonight, we cut it off at the source." Janet clutched Jack's hand, her knuckles white. "What if it's too strong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What if we can't stop it?" Lorraine stepped forward, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "We have to believe that we can," she said softly. "It's been toying with us, but tonight we fight back. It's our only chance." With that, they descended the stairs to the basement once more. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of decay stronger, more pungent. As they reached the bottom, they saw it. The old wooden door, ajar, a faint, eerie light emanating from within. Without hesitation, Ed pushed the door open, and they stepped into the darkness beyond. The room was different this time, larger, more cavernous, as if the house itself had twisted and expanded to accommodate the malevolent force within. The walls were covered in symbols, ancient arcane markings that pulsed with an unnatural light. In the center of the room stood the entity. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer a fleeting presence in the corner of their eyes. It had taken form, a twisted, grotesque figure, standing nearly 10 feet tall, its body a mass of writhing darkness. Its eyes burned with a fiery red glow, filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. Its mouth, twisted into a grotesque grin, opened to reveal rows of jagged, rotting teeth. The priests began to pray, their voices rising in unison, but the entity simply laughed, a deep, guttural sound that echoed off the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. It stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, suffocating as it reached out with long, clawed hands. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard, grating and painful to hear. "I have waited centuries for this moment. Your prayers are meaningless." The room began to shake violently, the walls cracking, the floor buckling beneath their feet. The lights flickered and the air grew impossibly cold. The entity's power was growing, its form solidifying, becoming more real, more present. Ed stepped forward, holding his crucifix high. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place!" he shouted, his voice strong, unwavering. The entity recoiled slightly, its grin faltering, but it quickly recovered, laughing even louder. "Your God has no power here," it snarled. "This world is mine." Lorraine, her eyes wide with terror but filled with resolve, reached out with her mind, trying to connect with the entity, to find a way to weaken it. She felt its hatred, its anger, its desire to break free. But she also felt something else, something that made her blood run cold. This was no ordinary haunting. This was a ritual, a dark ancient rite that required sacrifice, a soul innocent and pure to break the entity's chains and release it into the world. And the Smurl children were the intended sacrifice. Lorraine gasped, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "It's after the children!" she cried, turning to Ed. "We have to protect them. They're the key to its freedom." Ed's face went pale as the truth sank in. They were out of time. The entity was moments away from completing the ritual, from breaking free of its prison. They had to stop it, but how? The house began to collapse around them, the walls crumbling, the ceiling buckling under the strain. The entity grew larger, more powerful, its form solidifying, becoming more monstrous with each passing second. The priests continued to pray, but their voices were drowned out by the entity's laughter, by the sound of the house tearing itself apart. And then, in a moment of clarity, Lorraine knew what had to be done. "There's only one way to stop it," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to destroy the house. It's the only way to break the connection, to trap it here forever." Ed hesitated for only a moment, then nodded. "Do it," he said, his voice filled with resolve. Lorraine reached into her bag, pulling out a bundle of dynamite that they had brought as a last resort, something they had hoped they wouldn't need. She quickly set the charges, her hands trembling as she worked. The entity, sensing what they were about to do, let out a deafening roar, its form shifting, writhing with fury. "Hurry!" Ed shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. As Lorraine finished setting the charges, she turned to Ed, her eyes filled with tears. "This is it," she said softly. "We have to go now!" They ran, the priests following close behind, as the house began to collapse around them. The entity surged forward, desperate to stop them, but it was too late. They reached the top of the stairs, bursting through the door just as Lorraine hit the detonator. The explosion rocked the neighborhood, the house collapsing in on itself, a massive cloud of dust and debris rising into the night sky. The entity's roar was cut off abruptly, swallowed by the destruction as the house was reduced to rubble. In the silence that followed, the Smurls huddled together outside, their faces streaked with tears, their bodies trembling with fear and relief. They had survived, but the cost had been great. Their home was gone, destroyed in the battle against a force they couldn't fully comprehend. Ed and Lorraine stood together, watching the smoldering remains of the house, their faces grim. They had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. The entity was trapped, but it wasn't destroyed. It was still there, buried beneath the rubble, waiting, biding its time. And then as they turned to leave, Lorraine felt a chill run down her spine. She froze, her eyes widening in horror as she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, carried on the wind. "I'll be back." The word sent a wave of terror through her, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew deep down that the entity wasn't done with them. It was trapped, but it was far from defeated. And when it returned, it would be stronger, more powerful, more determined than ever. As they walked away from the ruins of the Smurl house, Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The entity had been stopped, but it wasn't gone. And one day, it would return. The Smurl family's nightmare was over, but the horror they had faced would never truly leave them. And for Ed and Lorraine Warren, the fight against the darkness would continue, knowing that somewhere, deep beneath the earth, a malevolent force was waiting for its chance to rise again.